Chapter 5, 2006 to 2008. The Frog into a Prince Show. The Stone Ridge house was my monastery. The moment I set foot in it, I knew my time there would be an important one. I owned very little with regard to furniture. It was mostly what the previous owners had left. A bed, a couch, and a dining table with a few chairs. The living room had a huge stone fireplace. The internet was spotty, as the street didn't have high-speed service yet, and the dish connection was bad. There were no smartphones. The smartest one was still a Palm Pilot or a BlackBerry back then. In short, other than a landline, there was very limited connection with the outside world. Laura and I had joint custody of our dog Sophie, and she was with me twice a month for a week at a time. The arrangement worked perfectly. I spent weeks on end by myself up there and rarely got any visitors. Sophie was a good intermittent companion. My son and his then girlfriend visited me from Germany a few times, which was always great, and once in a while a friend stopped by. But in general, I was by myself. Over the next 2 years, I was involved in 2 romantic relationships successively. I was not in a very stable state internally and was still reorienting my inner compass after the breakup with Laura. I had lost my connection with Jesus for a while, or at least I was more aware than usual of pushing him away into a far corner somewhere. Again, the 2 women I was involved with sequentially over the next 2 years were, looking back, of utmost importance to my life. I feel deep gratitude toward them now, but my heart broke numerous times during those 2 years. It was way too soon to try to start up anything serious yet. I was far from ready. The gap within me, the longing to be complete, moved to the foreground. It was in my face and I couldn't deny it any longer. In one sense, and funny how time works, those 2 years were a continuation of the process of what had started in the foundation 10 years earlier. I know this sounds odd, but I think getting together with Laura after the stay at the foundation held a lid over a lot of stuff, a wound, if you will, they were still trying to close. It wasn't an outside wound, but it was one that needed healing nevertheless. It was the wound of my deeply held belief that I would only be able to experience love through other people. So, during those 2 years in the Stone Ridge house, So during those 2 years in the Stone Ridge house, I think I pulled back all the covers to look at what I thought I had processed already. This was incidentally also the time of the great real estate crash of 2008. All this forced me back within and to face myself in a different way all over again. I also knew I needed to rekindle my relationship with Jesus, whom I had put in a corner over the years prior. But as he said, nobody puts Jesus in a corner. A year or so before, toward the end of my relationship with Laura, I had started seeing a therapist. I had gotten a name from a good friend of mine and hesitantly made an appointment. I remember just before I went into her office, I thought it would probably be a waste of time. I almost left. I'm so glad I didn't. I'm so glad I didn't. I still see Julie now, 15 years later. Not as often as back then, but we have stayed connected over the years, and she has been a big part of my path through what has often felt like a dark forest. Julie's approach includes, among others, imaginary journeys into the subconscious. I always had a creative visual mind, and her method allowed me to go beyond the intellect to a place where I could freely express what was going on inside myself. As part of the work, after a while, Julie suggested writing the sessions down, if for nothing other than future reference. That was the best suggestion ever. As I was already used to writing down my thoughts and what was going on within me, this felt natural. The first one I wrote down was not based on a session with Julie, but described an image I'd had after I had moved to the Stone Ridge house. I'm including it here as this was the first piece of descriptive writing about the subconscious images that emerged and feelings that were associated with them. Ice cave. I'm kneeling, cowering on the cold, smooth floor, my hands over my bald head. My feet are blackened from dirt. They are cold, haven't been warm in a long, long time. A single ray of sunlight streams from the small opening high up in the cave's ceiling. A prison cell. Isolation. Abandonment. Cold fury. Most of the day I spend in the shadows, glancing at the beam of light, too afraid to approach it, yet too afraid to stay. The instant I can bring myself to enter its radiance, I cower to protect myself from its tremendous heat and brightness. My eyes are closed, my hands and arms give little shelter and protection from its merciless intensity. Love, pure, uncompromising love, entering each and every pore of my body. I will not look up. Down here is my home, my very existence, my protection, my armor, and my life. I will forever stay. My feet almost disappear into the surface of the ground. What is to gain in looking up? My eyes will bleed, and blinded, I will go back into the shadows from which I came. I will not lift my eyes. I will spend eternity in here if I have to, longing for the light, but too afraid to break the spell I placed upon myself. Freedom lies not there, but in here. Here, down here, I'm free, for only in darkness sure protection lies. But I have longed. I have longed since I can remember. How can I long for something and be utterly afraid of it at once? My hands are covering my ears, trying to still the sweet, sweet melody the light emits. Please let me go. I can't reach the opening high up in this self-proclaimed imprisonment, for if I could, I would close it and no ray of light would disturb my peace, so I could live forever in darkness undisturbed. How long? How long until I will allow myself to stand, to lift my eyes and arms to welcome my most precious, most beloved self? I do not trust its gentle voice, its soft whispers, words so ancient, spoken so long ago that I forgot their loveliness. I forgot the breath of air, the filling of my lungs with freedom's scent. I forgot so long ago that I turned love into my enemy, freedom into imprisonment, and hope into despair. I love you, it whispers, like the summer wind caressing a field of flowers in the setting sun. I love you, for I am you. There's no meaning in these words. There's too much meaning in these words. For if I would speak them, there would be no turning back, not a single thought was to remain. My past would be gone, my future would be no more, and now would be all there is. Do I dare? Do I dare to even let the possibility, the slightest consideration, enter my tomb? Who would I be? Who would I be? Would I be? This was the first of many essays, circling around two similar themes, love and the fear of love. The essays were all more or less directly about Jesus. As he symbolizes love, they all were in one shape or form about him. The ice cave was about this feeling I was aware of within myself of not being able to step into the light. During my relationship with Laura, I was aware of the fact that I was too afraid to step into the light and rather stayed within the shadows, sometimes Laura's shadow and sometimes an imaginary one, but I was far from ready to step into the light. When I wrote it, I could feel the fear of taking this step and instead cowering in the darkness, attracted by the light and, at the same time, utterly repelled by it. I had developed a routine that included long walks with my dog, listening to Ken Wapnick's tapes, and watching Lord of the Rings and the TV series The West Wing. I must have watched those close to a dozen times during that time. The West Wing was written by my all-time favorite writer, Aaron Sorkin. For me, he's the Mozart of writing. During my screenplay writing years, I had studied him, trying to assimilate his genius with no success. The West Wing wasn't only about grey writing for me. It is basically King Arthur's Camelot translated into modern times. It was very moving and inspiring most of all. One of the episodes was called No Blood. It's about Toby Ziegler, the communications director in the White House, who tells his deputy that he wasn't able to write, that no blood was going to it. I knew that feeling very well and wrote a short essay about it. No blood. There's no blood flowing to it. I have nothing to say, too deeply immersed in my own thought process. And what comes out is flawed, always the same, circling around an identical theme, repeating itself endlessly. I'm not really ready to write. Not at the point where it spills out, overflows, and rushes from the well and onto the lawns of my mind. Sometimes I think I'm not ready to share, hoarding thoughts like sheep, vigilant that none of them escapes into the world. There's a time for it all. Now is the time to listen. Apply, to slowly make progress. Now is a time to undo, to correct, to do nothing at all. The courage to do nothing, the courage not to change anything, the courage just to observe and wait and to judge it not. To accept the simple truth that there's nothing inside of me or you that needs to change, that calls for a response other than you are now, as you have always been, my beloved brother. How do I awaken from this nightmare of isolation and despair? I do but recognize that what is changing, what is bound to time, what I see or hear or touch, or what I still believe, does not affect eternity, does not affect my true identity at all. I am now, as I have ever been, forever free of slavery of any kind, especially the self-imposed, the one that keeps me prisoner within my own dark cell. The doors are barred no longer. The guards have long since left this darkened tomb. My mind is free to follow my own promise, given by myself before time was. The promise that nothing I think or say or do or fail to do can change eternal love. I but believe a lie that seemed to be the truth for such a short period of time that no trace of it remains to linger still, to keep me separate and apart. And now we say Amen, for you have come to show us that what has life can never die, and what is love is changeless in eternity. This was definitely a precursor to me starting to write books a few years later. Looking back, it was true that I wasn't ready to share, but rather I needed to remain deeply immersed in my own internal process. The next essay was written after a session with Julie. It was called The Door. It is based in part on a painting by Hans Werner Zahm, a German painter whose work I had admired since my early 20s. The painting is called Erinnerungen, Memories. The Door. A vast green landscape, endless fields and hills. The sun sits behind a large block, casting a shadow on the land I walk on. As I come closer, I see that the dark block is a wooden door. Massive, ancient, at least 30 stories high and as wide. When I reach it, I sit down, leaning my back against it. The wood radiates warmth, comfort, heated from the sun on the other side. When I look towards the direction I came from, I see an ocean of human shapes in the distance. I can identify faces, my family, friends, clients, co-workers, and strangers, all walking together towards the door. Their shapes are dark and distinct. I get up, step away from the door, and turn towards it. Its two massive sides open slightly, creating a small gap in the center, just large enough for me to look through to the other side. The same landscape. A mirror image of the one I'm in. The only difference, it is drenched in light. I see the same people there, family, friends, clients, co-workers, and strangers. Shapes of light, almost indistinguishable from each other. There's a chorus, slightly below my ability to hear, easily dismissible, coming from the light shapes. Utter and complete joy radiates from them. For a moment I hear the song, a hymn, inviting me to join in, to add my voice to theirs. My hands touch the doors. One hand on each of them. There's the slightest push, ever so gently, pressing against the palms of my head. No, I think quietly. The pressure lessens. The massive doors respond to my smallest wish and close. I sit down again, warming my back on it. There's no rush, no urgency, no time. Just the comfort of the knowledge of where I am always and where we all are here and in eternity. This image for me is the quintessential expression of my relationship with Jesus. I know it is completely within my power to open the door. I also know that I'm not ready to do so, and he's certainly not pushing me. For him, I'm already on the other side of the veil. And even though I long to open the door and step through it, I know I have to wait for myself and for the fear to subside enough to take this step. Once I do, it will be the biggest step I'd ever taken, and also the smallest, as the door is never more than an arm's length away. I sometimes lie in bed at night and hear the chorus of the voices on the other side, and the longing inside me swells up, allowing me to open the door just a little bit more. I warm my face in the sun for a moment, knowing that everyone is there with me. Then I close it again. I think the most important aspect of Jesus in my life is that I know now, with absolute certainty, that the door is there. It is set in eternity, unchanging and forever, ready to be opened. This has nothing to do with death. Going through that door can happen now, at this very moment. I could open it and peace would embrace me, surmount me in complete gentleness and stillness and love. But not yet. Not yet. The next piece is a short poem that also came out of the sessions with Julie. It encapsulates the intense feeling of loneliness I had felt as a child at times. That feeling still lingered within me during the time in Stone Ridge, and once in a while it would emerge as if to say, "Don't forget, I'm still here," reminding you that this part of you still needs to be healed. Isolation. It is the hour before dawn. The sky is cold and grey. Before me the tundra extends into infinity. A high plateau, isolated, vast, and raw. I stand next to a low fire, looking out onto the horizon. 11, maybe 12 years old. A tent not far from me, on the other side of the fire pit. Inside lie my parents. They had just died. My mother passed last night from a short, violent fever. My father's body still warm. He died this morning about an hour ago. His agonizing screams left with him. The chilling wind cuts into me. Complete isolation covers me, wraps its arms around me, holds me, won't let go. There was still a lot of work to do with this little boy who was unable to cope with the loneliness he had felt. Julie provided ample opportunity to do just that. In a lot of the sessions, we invited the boy into our midst, a continuation of what I had started at the foundation when I invited Jesus into my memories. One of the images, I didn't write that one down at the time, had to do with my parents. After their divorce, as I previously explained, I had stayed with my father and my sister went with my mother. My parents didn't speak to each other, and in order for me to go to my mother, I sometimes had to lie to my father and stepmother. In the image, I saw myself in an arena, like the one in Gladiator, standing in the center, holding a sword in one hand and a shield in the other. To my right stood my father, to my left my mother. The rules of the arena were such that in order for me to keep one, the other had to die. It was an impossible situation and one I was still struggling with as an adult. The solution I came up with during the session was that I would drop my sword and shield and walk away from both, which I did symbolically, I believe, when I moved to the US. In one of Ken's tapes, he talks about a section from a book called The Rainbow by H.D. Lawrence. In it, a family dynamic is explained. As the parents were fighting all the time, Anna, the daughter, was trying to hold up one of the end of the arch, either with her father or with her mother, as they couldn't hold the arch with each other. The responsibility for the child was unbearable. At one point, the parents dissolved their conflict, allowing Anna to let go of the arch and play under it, which was now held by her father on one side and her mother on the other. I knew that this conflict was still active within me, waiting to be released. Several of the inner journeys I took with Julie were directly related to Jesus. Below is one of them, from around the same time. The dome. I stand inside a high dome. The surfaces of its walls are smooth, black, covered with tiny little lights, like the night sky with millions of stars, blinking, shimmering against the dark ceiling, and illuminating every inch of the dome in soft light. I stand with my back against the wall, On the other side of the dome, about 300 feet across, stands a figure. I cannot make out who it is at first. My arms are stretched out sideways and pinned against the wall as if held by a magnetic force of some kind. It's impossible for me to move them. From a distance, I must look either as if I'm crucified or as if I'm welcoming whoever comes to me with open arms. The figure starts walking toward me, not fast, just steadily. I can feel waves of love emanating from it. It is actually not a feeling at all. It is an experience so all-encompassing that everything else, my past, my present and future, my identity, myself as I know it, has lost its meaning without leaving a vacancy. The boundaries of me and I are no longer in existence. Tears run down my cheeks. Steadily the figure comes closer. I become aware suddenly that I'm trying to move my arms. I'm trying to get them off the wall. With every step, my attempts become more intensified. Now I see that the figure is Jesus. He's halfway across the large dome, and the closer he comes, the more I try to get my arms to move. Suddenly they are free, and I wrap them around myself in an embrace as if to protect myself. As I do this, the very moment my arms lose contact with the wall, all the lights in the dome, the thousands and thousands of little stars, go out. Complete darkness engulfs me. I stand, my arms wrapped around my own body in complete blackness. There's no sound. I can't see him or hear him any longer. It feels oddly comforting. Cold, suspended somehow, but strangely comfortable. But I can't stay like this. Too long have I lingered in the dark. Too long have I hoped for the light to come. Slowly, carefully, as if not to disturb the air around me, I open my arms. It is as if I'm opening myself to the darkness around me. As I reach the point where my arms are almost stretched out, the magnetic force pulls them back to the wall. The pull is firm and controlled. It doesn't hurt. The moment my arms touch the surface of the wall, the lights come back on, all at once. There's no loud noise, no flash of lightning. The lights just come back on and everything is illuminated. The light itself is soft, kind, gentle, almost nurturing. But make no mistake, for within its reach there's absolutely no place for me to hide. So I stand there, arms open, looking at Jesus, who slowly starts walking toward me again. Waves of love. I'm sobbing, at times seeing only an outline of color and light and not him. As he comes closer, I turn my head away. As if sitting in a dentist's chair, and just before the hand holding the drill reaches my mouth, I turn my head, trying to avoid the unavoidable. Please don't come closer, I beg him. Stay where you are. The waves of love are overwhelming, vast, incomprehensible, and utterly unmanageable. He stops, stands still. Go back, I say. I so much want to pull my arms from the wall again, but somehow I don't. Just stay there, don't move. I look at him, 30 feet away, tears streaming down my face. I can hear myself whispering, no, please, no, I'm not ready. Not at all ready for you or for what you represent. I'm not ready, I'm not ready, I'm not ready. And with that, and cutting through the intense love, pushing it away, forcing it to stand down, there's suddenly sadness so complete, leaving no space for anything else and piercing me like 1,000 knives. And so I stand under the stars, my back against the wall, sadness clenching my chest, unable to let him in. Let love be what it is, accept it, become it. How long will I stand here? I do not know. How long is one moment in eternity? What I realized over time was that any pain I felt in connection with anything in this world, like loss or a lack of something, was never about the thing itself. It was always about denying the love that was inside me. For the drop of water to deny itself the ocean is the most painful thing there is. That pain is cloaked in myriad causes we're seemingly pained by. It's never that. The pain we usually experience is a symbolic representation of the moment we turned our back on ourself, our true self, God, love, whatever you want to call it. Pain, whatever the shape, is always the pain of not letting love in, of settling for crumbs instead of the feast love has prepared for us. Having learned a trade as an electrician, I know that in electricity, resistance generates heat. The more resistance a wire has, the more heat the electricity that flows through it generates. Light bulbs are the best example of that. It is not a big jump to associating heat with pain and our resistance to love, electricity, as painful. One of the eternal conflicts I had become keenly aware of during that time was that all my life I felt as if I was searching for love. That's why none of my relationships lasted. There was still a deep gap within me, a hole that could not be filled, as far and wide as I searched. I knew this was a biggie, but I had no idea how to solve it. The following short essay came out of that conflict. My search for love made me look for crumbs. This is the first time, I believe, I consciously looked at this issue with a true willingness to have it solved. It is also significant as I took back the power I had given away most of my life. No more crumbs. There's a line in A Course in Miracles I find myself thinking about often these days. Here does the Son of God ask not too much, but far too little. As I look at myself, I realize that right now I'm accepting crumbs. I have to admit that by and large I am content with the scraps and leftovers of life. I'm cowering under a table that is filled with a feast, but waiting for pieces here and there to drop to the floor, barely enough to survive, yet not quite enough to live. I mean this on all levels, emotionally in relationships with others, physically with money and work, and spiritually. I'm too embarrassed and too ashamed to stand up and join the beautifully set table in the large, magnificent dining hall of life. All my brothers and sisters are there. This meal provided to us by love itself has everything we need and plenty of it. But my thoughts still revolve around the idea that I'm not a prince among princes, but a thief, unworthy of lifting my eyes and beholding the sheer beauty of life's promise. I can barely function in this self-proclaimed state of being. How could I? I am not made to cower. I am made to stand up with my head held high, not to distinguish myself from others, but to join them in their magnificence. I am not made for scraps. I am made to accept my inheritance, my glorious self, our glorious self. I could join my family at the table, but right now I'm angry instead. Angry at the crumbs, angry at the ones who dropped them, angry at myself for letting me go to this point of an unrewarding existence within my tiny kingdom of lies. They are lies, for at some point I traded true magnitude for littleness. They are lies because I am content with scraps, so I can blame them for not giving me enough. I accept the lie within me that it is my fate to live this way. Who am I to get up and take my rightful place at the table? Who am I to betray all the others who are down here with me waiting for scraps themselves? Who will I be without this gaping hole within my soul? This reminds me of Emmylou Harris's song Orphan Girl. Quote, "But when he calls me, I will be able to meet my family at God's table. I'll meet my mother, my father, my sister, my brother, no more an orphan girl." The truth is, it is freedom I fear. It is love and it is freedom. It is true happiness that sends cold shivers down my spine. I'm accepting crumbs for my inheritance as a child of God is too threatening for me to accept. It is time for the frog to become a prince, a good friend of mine once told me. I'm still waiting for a miracle to come. But while I wait for myself, I declare here and now that I will no longer accept the crumbs, but that I will rather fix my eyes at the empty chair at the table, that I will stand up and accept my true identity, a prince, beloved son of a loving father within a kingdom ruled by love itself. Writing this down was an interesting process. I didn't know where it was going, and the realization that I had, in fact, accepted crumbs into my life happened while I wrote. The declaration at the end was similar to the moment on New Year's Eve a decade earlier when I proclaimed aloud that I wanted to awaken. I felt the power radiating from the page when I wrote down that I would not accept crumbs any longer. This next piece is out of sequence and happened a few years after No More Crumbs. I'm including it here as it has a direct connection to it. It came out of a session with Julie that I had written down afterwards. I edited the piece slightly for clarity. The force field. I have been thinking about my resistance to writing lately. I felt that there's this barrier that comes up whenever I want to write or do things creatively. It wasn't there all the time, but it is there more than not. Actually, it is more like I have to sneak in the writing between the pretty solid wall of almost constant resistance. I decided to talk to Julie about it. When I sat down with her and started to describe it, I realized that the resistance felt like a force field around me. I could almost stretch out my hands and touch it, like compressed air or a magnetic field of sorts. It surrounded me and seemed to come out of the top of my head. From above, it was pink-colored. I could see through it to the outside, but it was like looking through a darkened window. When Julie asked me what the purpose of the force field was, my first thought was to protect myself from influences from the outside. Like a defensive wall, I built around myself to protect my personal space from intrusion. I thought about this a bit further, but felt that even though it made sense, that wasn't the whole truth. There was more to it. I didn't really need that much personal space to write. A laptop and headphones provided plenty of that usually, and I could make time for it if I really wanted to as well. Then a strange thought occurred to me. What if the force field wasn't there to protect me from the outside? What if it was there to protect the outside from me? As I let the thought stand there for a while, Julie asked me to maybe follow it and see if it leads me to something in my past, an image, a feeling, or something similar. And then I saw a room high up in the tower of a medieval castle. There were large paintings on the walls of the round room. I was an older man with a white gruff beard and a long robe of sorts, standing in front of a large canvas on an easel. I think I painted landscapes. There were several servants. I must have been very powerful or influential and very rich. I did not care at all about the servants. I did not treat them with respect, but was certain they were all literally there to serve me and that I didn't need to concern myself with their well-being at all. The servants were very loyal. They loved me and served me selflessly. I never said a kind word to them, nor gave them praise. In fact, I was rude at best and cruel at worst, and still they served me. I wanted to tell them that I was sorry for what I did, for how I behaved towards them. When I told them, I realized that they did not feel how I thought they would feel. They didn't feel mistreated. They loved me. I felt touched by their sentiment and their silent assurance that I didn't have to go through all this trouble and that I was forgiven. I thought the vision was over when suddenly an image came up that was connected to another session. No More Crumbs, see above. Suddenly something clicked and I connected the two images. I realized to my astonishment that the people who had sat at the table in No More Crumbs were the very same servants from the vision in the tower. When I let that image rise up within me again, seeing myself under the table, too ashamed to get up, a hand reached down. I very reluctantly took it and I was back in the tower room. Tremendous comfort enveloped me at that moment. I was finally home after seeming eons of searching and hiding in fear and shame. I noticed the paintings on the walls and realized that what looked like paintings weren't paintings at all. They were windows showing the magnificent landscape outside the tower. Rolling hills and forests on one side and the ocean and rising sun on the other. It seemed like an optical illusion, for I was not sure if they were just windows of the landscape that looked like paintings, or if they were paintings that depicted the landscape in such realistic fashion I couldn't tell the difference. I'm thankful for everyone sitting here with me at the table, thankful that they held a chair for me, a chair that nobody else could fill. We each have one, and it stays empty until we get up from the floor and join the banquet that is set in time but clothed in timelessness. The chair is our inheritance. It has been there since time was, and will be there until time disappears again and we are all back in our home that we have never left and which has never left us. For the longest time I've struggled with the belief that in order to be spiritual, I had to give up the material world to some extent. This was reflected in the conflict during my stay at the foundation of whether or not I should follow Jesus and let go of anything material in the process. Before the course, I had read a lot about creative visualization to obtain material things. It works, no doubt about that. I can attest to it. One example I remember vividly is the following. In my mid-20s, I was obsessed with a certain car. It was a Toyota 4Runner. We didn't have SUVs in Germany, and this one looked stunning to me. I wanted it. I was in the phase of reading everything I could get my hands on about creative visualization and applied what I had read. I test drove the car so I could get a feel for it. It was amazing. Then I visualized myself sitting in it, driving around in it, visiting people and places in it. There was a song I loved during that time. It was Billy Joel's Leningrad. When I listened to it, I was usually overcome by emotion, and I used those emotions to fuel my visualization. In my mind's eye, once or twice a day, I drove the car while listening to the song. I felt it. I told my then girlfriend Bärbel about it, of course. 5 months after I started, it was my birthday. My best friend Thomas and my girlfriend told me to drive to a certain parking garage. They were in the car with me and we drove into the garage. There stood, in one of the parking spots, the black Toyota 4Runner, a red bow around the mirror. I couldn't believe it. Literally. I thought they had rented it for a day or so. We sat in it and my girlfriend told me to open the glove compartment. The registration was in my name. My girlfriend had had an accident a few years prior and just then had gotten a large sum of money from the insurance. She told me afterward that even though I didn't ask her to buy me the car, of course, she felt absolutely compelled to do so. I remember sitting inside repeating, "It's possible, it's possible, it's possible," over and over. So yes, it's possible. But. Yes, there's a big but. First of all, I had no business owning a car like this, as I didn't make enough money to pay for the tremendous amount of gasoline it used. That took all the fun out of driving it. Secondly, I felt a good amount of guilt afterwards for driving it. It was because I wanted all the world to see that I wasn't just this struggling guy who was selling organic dog food in a pyramid scheme. I even showed it off to my ex-parents-in-law, who had always smiled sweetly when I told them about my spiritual insights when my ex-wife and I were still together. They had tried to hide their condescension and didn't take me seriously. With my new car, I was sure they would. Yes, I was somebody, I was special, and I felt guilty that I still felt the need to prove it. Anyway, 4 months later we had to sell the car. Now, 30 years later, I know asking for the Toyota 4Runner was still asking for crumbs. There was no peace in having the car, none whatsoever. But for that realization to happen takes a long time, at least for me it did. Looking back, would I change anything now? No. I wasn't ready for anything else at that time. My philosophy is this. We should try out things, see how they make us feel. They're all rungs on the ladder. As long as we don't stay on each of the rungs for longer than necessary and always keep our eyes on the end goal, we'll be okay. And even if we're stagnant for a while, who's to say that that isn't a necessary part of our process? We must take one step at a time. If it's wrong, we can adjust and correct it. In time, we will notice sooner rather than later when something doesn't fit or isn't right. On our journey, besides the end, which is where true peace dwells, nothing is written in stone. I long since came to the conclusion that it doesn't matter so much what I do, but with whom I choose to do it. Is it with Jesus or my ego? That's really it. The most mundane task, if done with Jesus or the right mind, becomes a healing task for all involved. The most epic gesture, if done with the ego, has very little benefit to anyone. As for crumbs, During my years in the Stone Ridge house, I would revisit the conflict between the material and the spiritual world periodically. For the frog to become the prince, I knew I needed to look at the image of me cowering under the table, waiting for leftovers to fall to the floor, symbolizing me choosing to be with my ego, my small self, instead of with the magnificent self represented by Jesus. The image in the force field, I believe, represents the forgiveness that had happened. I was no longer an outcast by my own judgment. I was ready, to some degree, to accept my place at the table among equals.